For me, more than half the magic of being a photographer happens long after I capture the image. When I get back, connect to my workstation, copy images over, and start reviewing them in Adobe Lightroom, they really come to life. Hi, I'm Andrew Childress for Envato, and welcome to Lightroom Classic for Beginners. This course is going to give you everything you need to become a master of Lightroom. We're going to tackle everything that might be holding you back from using Lightroom with your images. The first thing that you'll learn is about the various versions of Lightroom and which one might be right for you. Then we'll also teach you how to store your images safe and sound so that you're never without access and you're always backed up. After that, we're going to tackle the art of reviewing a shoot. That is downloading it onto your computer, picking out the best images, and really sequencing it together in a way that tells a story. After that, you'll learn the art of corrections, which is how you polish an image. You take it from its raw format and get it looking just good enough to show off to others. From there, you'll take on more creative edits. You'll really get to apply your creative style to images and hone in on creating that signature look that sets you apart from other photographers. That's really where the fun begins. After that, we'll teach you all the ins and outs of exporting photos so that they're always ready for social media, online, or sharing in practically any format. This course is really the best way to conquer any fears you might have about turning to an app like Lightroom to manage your entire image library from start to finish. By the way, you can get unlimited access to extra assets like stock photos, presentation templates, Lightroom presets, and so much more with a service called Envato Elements. One subscription unlocks everything with unlimited access at no extra cost. For me, one of the things that I like to turn to Elements for is their unlimited Lightroom presets. These are some of the top quality Lightroom presets from across the web, and they're sure to help you style your images. It really saves you a lot of time, and it's a great way to experiment while you're building out your own style. So let's jump in. By the end of this course, you're going to be a confident Lightroom user who knows how to manage a catalog of any size. If you're familiar with Adobe products, there's something you've probably noticed. There are a ton of apps, and sometimes it's difficult to determine which one you should choose for a given task. In this lesson, we'll talk about one choice you might be making, choosing between Photoshop and Adobe Bridge and Adobe Lightroom. Many photographers make this choice, and this is what you need to know. So let's start with Photoshop and Bridge. Photoshop is practically a stand-in, genericized term for modifying a photo. Much of the modern photo editing workflow was born inside of this app, but it always had a shortcoming, and that was working at scale. I think back to when I first worked in Photoshop on editing weddings, and it was incredibly time-consuming. And what's more, managing the edits I'd add on top in these massive PSD files was a total disk space hog. Of course, in 2005, along came Adobe Bridge. This is a tool that typically works in conjunction with Photoshop. It's a robust file browser that also has Adobe Camera Raw built in. Camera Raw, by the way, helps you process your raw image files out of camera. But what this combination doesn't do is own your photos inside of a cohesive catalog like Lightroom does. If you truly need pixel-level editing detail, then Photoshop is for you. Lightroom is more of a local adjustment, non-pixel-level editor. Many beauty and fashion photographers still lean on Photoshop when pixel adjustments and totally precise modifications are everything. But most photographers will choose Lightroom and then occasionally send a file over to Photoshop when those really precise adjustments are needed. So what does Lightroom do? In contrast, I think of Lightroom as the everyday tool for photographers working with many images. The catalog structure helps you keep your images all tied together into a database. That database helps you include and add many things that keep a larger library of photos manageable. That includes navigating your library based on metadata, whether it's what you add, like keywords and ratings, or camera metadata, like the camera you choose or the location you capture the photo at. Lightroom's magic is also that it helps you work with images in a way that's non-destructive. That means that the original image file is ultimately untouched and your edits come in over the top. Those over-the-top edits are stored inside of the catalog, not on top of the original image itself. In practice, that means that you can keep editing your images as many times as possible without wiping out the original quality. Ultimately, I think most photographers land on Lightroom. And if they have those detailed pixel level editing needs, the great news is that you can work with them together. In Lightroom, you can always use the Edit in Photoshop menu option that sends the photo to Photoshop. From that point, Lightroom and Photoshop will work on a separate copy of the image and allow you to make those really detailed adjustments that are occasionally necessary. If you're working at scale, Lightroom is probably the best choice. It gives you the most power to control a large catalog of images, and if you don't need all of the features Photoshop offers like design and text tools, it's the way to go. Of course, there's also multiple versions of Adobe Lightroom, so make sure to stay tuned to learn more about them and which one is right for you. You've already made the choice to jump into using Adobe Lightroom, but you might be facing another question now. That's the question of what version of Lightroom you should use. And to complicate things further, you might have noticed that Adobe calls all of these Photoshop Lightroom. It's a bit confusing, and for the purpose of this course, we'll shorten that to just Lightroom. So let's start by breaking down the two main versions of Lightroom. Those are what's now called Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC. Lightroom Classic was the original version of the app, and it was originally called just Lightroom. Now it's been rebranded with the Classic name to differentiate it from Lightroom CC. Lightroom Classic is powerful. It keeps your images in a catalog that acts as the database for how you change and modify your images. It's also kind of professional in nature. Your images don't go to the cloud, and it leaves the choice of where you'll store your files to you. It still has every tool you could possibly need inside of it, including local adjustments for modifying an area of an image. Now, in contrast, Adobe has launched the streamlined and more cloud-based version of Lightroom called Lightroom CC. This is a cross-platform editor where your images go to the cloud and you can edit from multiple devices. It's got enough tools for most users, but it definitely doesn't have the controls of Lightroom Classic. Many of the sliders are familiar, but you'll find yourself missing some of the more powerful controls that we'll cover in this course. You might also hear some people call Lightroom by its version name, such as Lightroom 6. This was the last version that Adobe published that had what's known as a perpetual license, or basically a version of the app where you buy it one time and it's yours to keep. This version really isn't getting meaningful updates anymore, so it might be best to opt for the subscription-based version. These are offered under Adobe's Creative Cloud subscription model. One of the best ways to get into Lightroom is to use the photography plan that Adobe offers. This gives you Photoshop as well as both versions of Lightroom. You need to choose between one version of Lightroom that you use and stick to, but this plan gives you the freedom to choose. Our course is going to focus on Adobe Lightroom Classic. This is the version that most professional photographers will opt for because it's truly fully featured, locally stored, and gives you the most power in how you work with your images and files. Keep watching to start your learning journey into Adobe Lightroom Classic. You've chosen the version, and now we're ready to work with our images inside of it. Our course includes a lot to learn, and before we jump into it, I want to give you a sneak preview of top tips for Adobe Lightroom. This will get you excited about the power of the app and show you some features in action. Let's look at 10 of my very favorite quick and easy tips for every Lightroom user. First up, you can use Caps Lock for Auto Advance. After you press the Caps Lock button, most other keys will automatically move you on to the next image. For example, a great way to use this tip is to press P on your keyboard, for example, to flag an image as a pic. With Auto Advance turned on, as soon as you do that, Lightroom moves to the next image. That keeps you moving rapidly, and it's easy to see how quickly you could cull a shoot with this on. 2, how about a performance boost? If you've built smart previews in Lightroom, you can work with them for lighter weight files. Go to the Preferences, then choose Performance to tick the box to use smart previews for editing. You'll see a performance boost because Lightroom's working off smaller copies of the files. 3, who doesn't need a bit more focus when they're working with images? Press the L key to turn on Lights Out mode and cycle through a few views here, each of which dims the workspace for focus on the image. 4, let's add our logo for personalization. We'll go to the Lightroom Identity Plate Setup menu as you're seeing me do here. On this menu, you can simply type your name or browse to a transparent PNG image to add it to the upper left area of your Lightroom workspace. It just makes you feel a little more at home, and it's great if you're showing off your work to clients inside the catalog. 5. Clipping is when you push an exposure adjustment a bit past its limits and you've lost detail in the frame. There's no point in editing an image to death to try to bring that detail back because it actually wasn't captured in the original image. So we press J on our keyboard to turn on the indicators. Blown out highlights show in red and 2 dark shadows lost to a black point turn blue. These are great indicators that help you edit. 6. You can organize your presets with something as simple as dragging and dropping. If you've got as many presets as me, it helps to do a bit of housekeeping periodically. Drag and drop presets into an order that works for you. I like to put my favorite go-to looks at the top of my list so that they're always nearby. Our 7th quick tip is another set of performance-focused adjustments for faster work in the app. On the Preferences Performance menu, check to see if Use Graphics Processor is on. If you have a laptop without a graphics card or without a powerful one, it's best to turn this off. And on Preferences File Handling, make sure your cache file is large. It takes up more space on your drive, but it speeds up the performance of the app. Mine is always set to at least 30 gigs. And finally, for one quick tip, run the File Optimize Catalog menu option to clean up periodically. It's just a bit of good housekeeping that keeps your catalog snappy. 8. Cropping is a great way to adjust your images in post-production. There are different ways you can do that, and it helps to have guides for how to compose the image with cropping. Press O on your keyboard to cycle through those overlays after you've opened the crop tool. They're fun and tried and true ways that some photographers believe help make a science of cropping by placing your subject at the intersection of lines, so try them out and see if you like the results. 9. With the help of the Lightroom plugin, the fader, you can fade the impact of your Adobe Lightroom presets. I've already installed the plugin, and with the Plugin Extras menu, you can launch the tool and then adjust the effect of a preset on an image. It gives you a whole new degree of freedom in how presets shape the image. Last up, if you're editing on a smaller screen, you need more screen real estate to keep everything in view. Right-click or control-click on the film strip and choose Auto Hide and Show to keep your panels out of view. When you hover over that part of the screen, they'll come back into view. Bookmark these 10 tips for later use as you're learning Lightroom. They help you work more efficiently and get back to shooting. As you're investing in building up your image library, there's one can't-miss step to consider. That's thinking about how and where you store your image files. A few of the essentials here. 1. Your images need to be kept safe. I know you love photography, and it kills me to think that due to a dead hard drive or lost computer, that you would lose the image files that you worked so hard to create. 2. Your images have to be stored in a way that isn't cumbersome. That means not overloading your hard drive with images because you have other files to store, of course. 3. Your images have to be accessible even when you aren't attached to the original files so that you can keep working and not stunt your progress. I'm going to teach you how to set up your files for Adobe Lightroom so that you check all of these boxes. It helps to know a bit at this stage about how Lightroom Classic works. It uses a catalog, which is a database of things it knows about your image library. It doesn't include the image files inside of it. It's really just a series of links and saved information about your images. When you make changes to images in Lightroom, those image files aren't really changed. They just have new information added to them as part of the catalog. This is also one of Lightroom's strengths because no matter how many times you adjust an image, you won't permanently save the settings, which keeps the image at full quality. It's called non-destructive editing, and it's so essential. Here's my recommendation about how to set things up. It's important to keep your catalog nearby. That means keeping it on your hard drive on your computer. Lightroom actually won't let you work off of a network drive if the catalog is stored there. I keep my catalog in a Dropbox folder so that it stays backed up and so that I have it nearby. Now, what about your images? I recommend keeping them somewhere else, not attached to your computer. That means using an external hard drive, including something like a network-attached storage drive that lives on your network. Either way, the important part is that you don't keep them on your primary computer. We're dealing with big images that will quickly take up all your space. Plus, what if your computer dies or is stolen? Backups matter, and keeping those source files away from your main device is a key. So, what happens when you disconnect from the drive? Maybe you're thinking that the images won't work anymore and you can't continue your edit. That's where smart previews come in. They live inside your Lightroom catalog and stand in for the original image so that you can keep editing. And they're much smaller than the original files, so you won't clog your entire hard drive with the images. I'll teach you how to create those in a later lesson. So with that in mind, remember, keep your catalog close and your images far away on an external drive. It helps us check all of our boxes, kept safe, keep working, and not disruptive to our day-to-day work with too many files to store. You'll learn how to implement exactly this setup throughout this course. If you're excited about Adobe Lightroom, you're probably ready to begin working in the app. Let's learn how to get started and import images and how to get organized. Having just launched Lightroom, we're in a new catalog here, and that means that there's no images inside of it yet. Let's start off by importing images. Let's go to File, Import Photos and Videos. Remember that Lightroom doesn't want to be greedy and suck up and move your images into the cloud or inside the catalog. All that we're really doing on this menu is telling Lightroom, hey, I want you to work with my images, and here's where they're stored. I've already dumped my photos that I'll use in this course into a folder. I'm going to use the folder browser here on the left side to find those images, so keep in mind where you put them on your computer to begin with. For now, I've got them stored on my computer, and later on I'll move them off to that external drive. I'm using the browser to find the folder where my images are stored. Now, with the folder selected, you'll see the images inside our selected folder showing here in the main panel in the center. You can scroll up and down to review what's set to be imported. You can also use the checkboxes in the upper left corner of the image to select or deselect an image for import. Make sure you also have this Don't Import Suspected Duplicates option so that you don't bring in images that you already have once you're using a mature catalog with a lot of photos in it. Basically, it just helps to make sure that you don't double up your images. Now, let's focus on one of the most important options here, and that lives at the top of the window. There's Copy, Move, and Add. All of these options will make an image available for use in Lightroom, but of course, each does something a little different. Copy will make a second version of your raw image files. With the Move option, they're added to Lightroom, but also moved to a new location on your computer. The Add option leaves the files in exactly the same spot in your folders, but it does still add them to the Lightroom catalog. Remember in our earlier lesson that it's best practice to keep our images not on our local hard drive, but on an external drive. I've got one plugged in now, and I'm going to move my images to that external hard drive. Let's go ahead and choose Move. Then on the right side, let's point Lightroom to where we want to store the files. I've set up my external drive and pointed it there. Now notice all of these folders that are in light gray. These are folders that will be created as Lightroom does the copy. And that's thanks to the fact that we've got this Organize option set to date. This is going to move each shoot on each day to a dated folder of its own so that we get the files organized. This is the type of step that I get excited about when I teach users Lightroom. It takes you from having this big mess of files in a single folder to bringing structure and organization to your image library. All of that adds up to saving you time by making it easier to navigate your library later on. There are many more options on this menu that you can use, but we've done everything we need to set up our library safely and securely. Later on, we'll learn to rename photos as well, but it's best to handle that in a separate step. Let's go ahead and press Import, and Lightroom will go to work moving photos from our hard drive to a newly organized set of folders. When it finishes, you're working here in the Lightroom catalog with your images available. And if you open up an Explorer or Finder window to see your external hard drive, the images are all nice and neatly sorted. It's using the metadata from the camera to see how to organize your images into that series of dated folders. Once you're working in Lightroom, make sure to notice the panels here on the left side that help you navigate your library. You can always click on all photographs to see your images all at once, but you can also browse the dated folder tree to show photos from a specific date. One last step. I want to encourage you to take a few minutes to rename the folders here in a way that's useful to you. Click on a single folder to view the images inside of it. Then right-click and choose Rename, and for each shoot, add just a bit of descriptive text at the end. That really powers up your organization and helps you navigate these because you might not always remember what date a shoot was on. By the way, it's important to take this step inside of Lightroom instead of just renaming them in Finder or Explorer. If you do that, Lightroom's link will break because it doesn't automatically know how the folder name changed outside the app. These setup steps might not be the most exciting part of using Lightroom, but it's important to think about what you've accomplished here. You've moved your images, added them to Lightroom, and put them into a nicely named folder structure. Keep watching to learn your way around organization with more tips. In our last lesson, I showed you how to import images and sort them into an organized structure. But many photographers are already committed to a current catalog and trying to make sense out of how to get that catalog organized. Let's learn how to organize and move your existing files. Let's view a folder full of photos in the Library module here in Grid View. Notice in my sidebar here that I've got a couple of hard drives, one internal and one external. And of course, we want to have all of our images moved to the external drive so that our images are safe and sound. Let's start with a simple example. I've already got a folder set here with my recommended naming structure, and the only thing that needs to change is to move it off to an external drive. This window shows the folder structure like an ordinary Finder window, and we can use it as a mini file manager. With the two drives side by side, it's as easy as dragging and dropping a folder from one section to another. Lightroom shows the progress of the copy in the upper left corner. The advantage of doing this inside Lightroom is again that you won't break any links or lose track of your files. I like to manage my files and folder moves inside of Lightroom for this reason so that I don't have to relink them later. Now remember that we want to implement a folder and file naming structure that helps us to stay organized. So how do we take an image library and get it sorted into that format? Well, it helps to know a bit about filtering so that we can pinpoint photos from a certain date. Remember that I have two drives here. One has a big folder of unsorted images and the other drive has some folders already set up. We need to take the unsorted images and get them into our structure. I'm viewing the images in that unsorted folder, and we need to group together photos from the same date so that we can grab them and sort them out into their individual folders. Let's learn a trick here. I'm going to press the / key to open up filtering. You'll learn more about this later, so just follow along for now. Let's click on Metadata and make sure that date is showing in the first column. If you need to find it, you can click on the drop-down to change one of these filter columns to date. Now, we need to hone in on a specific date so that we can pull these out and move them to a dated, sorted folder. Remember that we're going to put each shoot into a new folder based on the date of capture. I'm going to drill down through the dates in this window and select an individual date. Let's go ahead and create the folder that they'll move to on the external drive. I'll right-click and choose Create Folder inside the year, and then give that folder a name. Now, all that we have to do is start by selecting the images on the unsorted drive and select the ones that match the date. I'll press Command-A on Mac or Control-A on Windows, and I've got them all selected. Now, I just drag and drop, and the images are moved to the new folder. Then, just change your date to another day and repeat the process. Basically, we're using this metadata, the date captured, to filter down to images and then move them to the external drive. One last thing I want to show you. Sometimes your images might go a little haywire. Maybe you accidentally move them around outside of Lightroom and then the link breaks. The catalog just basically doesn't know where it's at. You'll get this nasty error that the original image is missing and you need to relink it. You're seeing me walk through pointing Lightroom to the new location here. And it helps to find the nearby photos as well, just in case you have other broken links. Now, this can also be helpful to know if you haven't added any images to an external drive. We could already see the external drive in the sidebar earlier, so we didn't have to worry about this. But you may not have added any images from it. Lightroom will show every drive with a photo in your catalog, but if you don't have any photos in the catalog on that external drive, it's not going to show. So how do you get it added? Well, in that case, I actually do recommend dragging and dropping outside of Lightroom and then relinking the photos. It works best if you move the entire parent folder first. Just as one more reminder, images don't live inside the Lightroom catalog. It's a database of lookups and indexes that remembers things about your images, like the adjustments you made and where they're stored. It's okay if you're starting with a disorganized library. Work on this process one step at a time. Carve it up in pieces and you'll be organized and efficient in no time flat. Maybe you haven't thought much in the past about the file names for your images. After all, they already have a name when you copy them from your camera, right? Well, you can also add so much with just a few simple steps in Lightroom. When we're finished, we'll take those ugly, meaningless file names and transform them into a file name that tells you just enough about the image whether you're working inside of Lightroom or not. Best of all, if you leave Lightroom, you'll still leverage the power of these better file names in other apps that you work in. In Lightroom, let's start off by making sure we're in Library View. Let's make sure we're in Grid View as well by pressing G. In Grid View, I like to ensure that I can see the file names at all times. So let's also make sure that we can see extras on the View, Grid View Style, Show Extras option. Now, in the main area, you can see each and every image's file name. Let's start by setting up our rename rule. With an image selected, let's go to the Library Rename Photo option. Then let's click the drop-down and choose Edit. Now, here's where the magic happens. You don't have to rename your files one by one. Instead, let's set rules and apply them to all images in the future. Here's how this works. We have fields that we can choose from that help us shape our file names. In my case, what I like to do is build in both the capture date and time of the image into the file name itself, and then add a bit of description. So let me show you what I mean. From the sequence and date dropdown, let's start off with a 4-digit year code. That means that for each image, the first part of its file name will be the 4-year capture date. You can see that there are tons of fields that you can choose from. The next part that I'll add is a 2-digit month code and then the 2-digit day code. Notice that as I'm adding these, that Lightroom shows you a simulation of how the selected file will be named after you apply the rule. Basically, Lightroom is going to read the metadata from each and every file and then individually rename each file based on the data that it finds for the capture date and time. This is really powerful. We're using the rules to tell Lightroom how each and every file should be named with a common set of rules. We've added a detailed date, but we know that there are probably many images in our library that would share a file name if we left it just like this. So let's also add a capture time. I'm going to click in this box and add a dash, and that dash will separate the next part of our rename rules. Let's now add an hour, minute, and second string as you're seeing me do here. This will ensure that there's not too much overlap in the file name. After all, we probably have a lot of photos on the same date, but getting it down to the seconds will help to differentiate the file names and make each one of them unique. And don't worry, Lightroom will automatically handle it if we have 2 photos from exactly the same second. It'll add a dash with a number after the fact so that no 2 file names completely conflict. One last step. Let's add another dash to break up the rename rule. I'm also going to insert a custom text field that we'll set for each rename. That lets us just type in a specific description each time we do a batch rename. We'll use this to describe the contents of the shoot. Let's click Done, and now we can add a description for this photo. Click OK, and presto, you can see that our image is renamed with our rules. This is so much cleaner than our random file names added by a camera. Let's rename more images. I'm going to click and then shift-click to select a series of images. Let's start the same rename process, except of course this time we just reuse our rules. I'm going to add that one line of custom text and we're good to go. All of the images are renamed now with the specifics. Now you've got a reusable set of rules. Start renaming your images batch by batch and you'll be finished in no time. It's great if your images follow a consistent file name structure. I know this might not seem like the most exciting work, but trust me, it helps you keep your library a bit more sane and add more meaning to the file names. In the introduction to this section, we talked about the ideal setup for Lightroom. That setup is to keep your images stored somewhere safely, like an external drive, and to keep your catalog stored locally. But you might be wondering, does that mean that I have to lug my external hard drive with me everywhere to continue working in Lightroom? After all, you might have used apps in the past where, if the images are missing or disconnected, you can't keep working. Thanks to Smart Previews in Adobe Lightroom, that's not the case. You can keep working from anywhere without missing a beat. Think of Smart Previews as compressed, reduced resolution copies of images that are much smaller in file size.
Chances are that you can keep your smart previews stored locally because they don't take up a lot of space and they're plenty good enough for day-to-day editing work. As you can see with this data, the raw image file size compared to the smart preview size is hardly comparable, and it shows just how many images you could keep locally that would never fit if you had to keep the raw image stored locally. The only time to worry about being connected to the original images is if you need to run an export at a high resolution. Even working off smart previews, you can export images that are 2500 pixels on the long side. There's a few ways that you can build smart previews in Lightroom. Let's learn how. First, it helps if you just automatically build these when you import images. On the Import Photos dialog, make sure the Build Smart Previews box is ticked. Anytime you import images, check this box, and Lightroom handles the hard work for you. But if you didn't build smart previews on import, it's not too late. First, make sure you're connected to the original images. Then select any images that you need smart previews for. One fast way to do that is just to select all in your library with Control-A or Command-A. Then go to the Library, Previews, Build Smart Previews menu. You'll see Lightroom go to work on building smart previews. Finally, there's a helpful tip to help you find the images that don't have the smart previews. In the Library module, press the / button to show the filter bar. On the drop-down menu, choose Smart Preview Status. You can hone in on images between Has Smart Preview and No Smart Preview. Filter for No Smart Preview and then build them out. My favorite part about Smart Previews is that they just work. When you're disconnected from the original images, the Smart Previews automatically kick in seamlessly. You might notice this icon that shows that you're working from the Smart Preview copy. Try it for yourself by building them and then disconnect your external hard drive. Smart previews are powerful. They help you strike the balance between quality and file size and ensures that you can keep working no matter where your images are stored.
In this section, we're going to explore the power of metadata. Let's learn more about what it is, what it does, and what it doesn't do for us. I think of metadata in two buckets. One is camera-created metadata. As the name suggests, this is what our camera adds to an image file when we capture a photo. Based on the factors that the camera knows, like the shutter speed, aperture, and time and date stored in the camera, this text is added behind the scenes to your image files. And with the help of an app like Lightroom, you can review and see it on your devices. Of course, camera-added metadata can typically be modified in post-production by apps like Lightroom as well. This is really helpful when you don't have the time set properly on your camera, as an example. The other type of metadata is user-added. This tends to be more qualitative type data. That means that you're using your judgment to add it to your images. It includes things like star ratings or keywords to describe the subjects, or even wide-open fields like color labels. Lightroom really has an incredible number of metadata fields that you'll learn how to leverage in this course. Now, why am I telling you this, and why does it ultimately matter? Well, here's the thing. Metadata is really the key to navigating a large library of images. If you want to command your library, you have to work the metadata. Because once you have the metadata, you can use it to filter and search your images. That helps you get to the image you have in mind with less work than manually scrolling through and finding it. Let's take an example. A client calls you and they have a special request. They need an image from a certain date. As long as you had it set on your camera, it will only take a few clicks to find the matching images. And if the request is more specific, you can filter on other factors like the rating to give them the best of the best from that date, for example. However, metadata isn't magic. Remember, the power of an app like Lightroom really expands when we invest the time and effort into adding the metadata that helps us navigate our library. Our goal in this course is to make Adobe Lightroom work for us. In the case of metadata, that means that we'll use it to find what we need with fewer clicks. Keep watching to find the fastest ways to not only find images, but also to add the metadata that you need to make those searches easy. In the intro lesson to this section, we talked about the types of metadata that you can add to your images. And what you already know is that there are multiple types of metadata that we can leverage, like user-added and camera-added metadata. Here's a workflow that I'm going to propose in this course to make metadata work for you and tame shoots of any size. These are the techniques you're going to learn in the upcoming lessons. They focus on using metadata to help you work. First, we're going to work with flags.
These are basically binary yes or no markers that say I'm going to keep this image or I'm probably going to discard it. Think about it. When you're working through a large set of images, the first choice you're usually going to make is if you should keep something or not. So we'll learn how to use these pick flags to mark that. This process is called culling, and it's the best tool for that step. Then we'll talk about the magic of color labels. These are flexible and they don't have to mean anything in particular. I love these because every photographer approaches their workflow differently, and it helps to have the tools to tag images the way you need them. That might include using a red label for the images you need to clear with the client first, or a blue label to show which ones need a bit of extra editing in Photoshop. After that, we're going to get a bit opinionated about our images. Sure, we already chose which ones we'd keep or toss, but there's more complexity than that. That means using the power of star ratings so that we can score images. Giving an image between 1 and 5 stars will help remind us how we rated the image. Again, photographers vary in how they'll use these fields, but the idea is always the same. You can use something like numeric ratings to mark or qualify images for a later step. You could use star ratings of 3 and above, for example, for making the cut for a client's sneak peek. And of course, once we have all of these metadata fields updated, we'll leverage them to our advantage with filtering, collections, and more. After star ratings, we'll tackle one of my favorite types of metadata, and that's keywords. These are the ways that we describe the subject or the contents of an image so that we can pinpoint what we need without any camera-added metadata. And of course, once we have all of these metadata fields updated, we'll leverage them to our advantage with filtering, collections, and more. That means that based on what we've added, we can navigate images and find them based on the matching criteria. Without metadata, our workflow is sure to feel chaotic. Let's start using these tools over the next few lessons to process our image collection. When it comes to user-added metadata, I think the most important type might just be keywords. It picks up where our camera leaves off in adding useful data to an image. By describing the contents of an image with the keywords field, we can leave these helpful breadcrumbs that help us find what we need at a moment's notice. With a simple search or filter, we can find all images that match a keyword that we have in mind. Let's jump straight into the action in the library module. To add our first keyword, start by selecting an image. On the right side here, find the keywording panel and type in a word that describes the image. Then press enter. Believe it or not, that's it. You've already added your first keyword. Of course, each image is often going to have multiple keywords. Use commas to separate your keywords and add them one after another. By adding this, we've left these reminders about what's in an image so that we can find it later. One note on this, when you're working with keywords, it's important to control your vocabulary. That means that if you use a keyword like cat, don't use feline later on. Limiting the number of terms you use makes your keywords much more usable and avoids any confusion later on. And since the camera adds metadata of its own, like what camera you used, for example, don't worry about adding a keyword like that either that already duplicates what's built into the file. You wouldn't add things like a shutter speed or the date of capture, for example, because there's other fields that already capture that. Now, keywords are powerful, but they also take time to add. Let's look at some ways to add keywords to multiple images simultaneously. I'm going to switch to grid view by pressing G on the keyboard so that multiple images are in view. Many of these images are going to have common subjects or locations, so what we can do is multi-select the images. I'm going to hold Command on my keyboard or Control on Windows and then click on several images as you're seeing me do here. With these images selected, I'll start to type a keyword here in the same keywording panel. When I press Return, it adds those keywords to all of the selected images. This is a great way to speed up your keywording and makes the task manageable with time. There's one more way to add keywords, and I really like this tool. It's called the Painter. To see it, press the T on your keyboard to show the toolbar below the image work area. This tool lets us spray paint keywords onto images. The way that I like to use this is to load up some comma-separated keywords here in the box. Then spray them onto the thumbnails to add them to the images that we're clicking on. Each image that you click on will get the keywords added that you already teed up. One note, if you have a few images selected, you might notice this asterisk showing in the keywording panel. This means that this is a keyword that some of the selected images have, but not all of them. Basically, use it to know that each image has different keywords. In a future lesson, we're going to learn how to find images that match our keywords, but I want to give you a sneak preview to see the power first. On Mac, press Command F or Control F on Windows to open this search box. It's as easy as typing a keyword and searching to find the images that match. This is really illustrative of the power of leveraging keywords. In just a few seconds, you can find the image you had in mind with a simple search. Without keywords, you're only as good as scrolling and scrolling, clicking and dragging, and zooming in on images until you find what matches. It's a much better way to work once you have keywords added. Later on, I'll show you advanced filtering to find keyword matches, but for now, I hope you see the potential. If you're going to invest the time in just one piece of metadata, make it your keywords. Describe your images, add the keywords, and then you're sure to navigate with ease in the future. So you've just gotten home from a shoot, and you need a way to start working through all of the images from the day. It takes work to process photos, and you need tools to help you categorize and review them. Maybe you want to mark the images to keep versus delete. It's the perfect first step to take when you're working through a large set of images. This lesson is taking place in the library module with our images already imported. Let's start by learning about flags, and it helps to start by knowing that an image can have 3 flag settings. An image can be flagged as a pick, flagged as a reject, or have no flag at all. The way that most photographers will use these statuses is that a flagged as pick means to keep, and a flagged as reject means you'll delete or not process the image. To set an image's flag status, one way that you can do it is to right-click the image and choose Set Flag and then the setting you have in mind. There's an even better way to do this that I want to show you that helps you to process images rapidly. Let's double-click on an image to switch to single image view. Then I'm going to press Caps Lock on my keyboard to turn on what's called Auto Advance. Now let's learn the keyboard shortcuts for flagging. You can use the letter P for flag as pick, U for unflag, or X for reject. Let's press P to flag this image as a pick. You'll notice that as soon as I do that, Lightroom moves on to the next image thanks to that auto advance setting that we changed just a moment ago. Then I can make a judgment about the next image and press the keyboard shortcut for the next one. Typically, I'll use U to just unflag an image even if it doesn't already have one to skip adding a flag, but many photographers will use X to reject an image. I like to do this process quickly and not over-deliberate about any images. We're just making a first pass so that we have our keeper images selected. Let's switch back to grid view by pressing G on our keyboard. Now, once you've invested the time in setting these flags, you might be wondering how to use them to your advantage. The best way to do that is with filtering. With a filter, you can tell Lightroom to only show you images that match a specific flag status. The fastest way to do this is to use the filters near the lower right corner of the app. If you can't see all of the icons, make sure to click on Filter to expand it. From left, these icons mean flagged, unflagged, and rejected. When you click on one of them, Lightroom filters the images in view to match your selection. You can also click on multiple so that it shows 2 flag statuses, like the flagged and rejected images. With this in mind, you can move to the next stage of an edit process. It's all about using fields like flags to help you narrow down your selection and keep you moving. Basically, this is one way that you can make a decision about which images to keep or process. You've got a ton of images, and with the flag, you can mark those keepers so that you keep moving. Let's look at another, more flexible piece of metadata that's really useful called color labels. What do our color labels mean, and what do they show us about an image? Well, that's the fun part. They mean whatever you want them to. In grid view here, you can see that we can right-click an image and choose Set Color Label with a corresponding color. There are 5 colors you can select from or reset it to having no color label at all. What I love about color labels is that they're really a blank canvas for you to do with as you please. Maybe you want to use a red color label to mark your client's sneak peeks, or a blue label for the images that need more touch-up work in Photoshop outside of Lightroom. However you decide to use them, you can use them to mark images in a way that lives inside of Lightroom instead of making separate notes. Let me show you one of my favorite ways to customize color labels with these custom descriptions. Let's go to the Metadata Color Label Set Edit option. You can actually rename any of these, so I'll change one as you're seeing me do here. When we go back to the library and add one of the labels, this time you'll see the custom description pop up as an overlay. You can change these to set cues for what each color label means to you. By the way, there are keyboard shortcuts for these too, and the auto advance trick you learned for flags works here as well. On your keyboard, pressing the number 6 sets a red color label, 7 adds yellow, 8 marks with green, and 9 marks as blue. Oddly enough, the purple color label doesn't have a keyboard shortcut, so you'll need to use the right-click menu to set it. Finally, notice that you can also filter based on color label. Just click on any of the color swatches here to add them to your active filter and show only the images that match a specific color label. Both of these features are ways that help you tame an image collection. Make sure to use them to help process even the largest set of photos. If you ask me which images in my catalog are my favorite, it won't take long to pinpoint them. That's thanks to the power of star ratings, which are most often used to rate an image. When you're working in the library module, it's really easy to add a rating. An image can have anywhere from 0 to 5 stars. My favorite way to add a star rating is simply with a numeric key on the keyboard. Just press the number of stars you want to add to an image and you'll see it added. You can always remove a star rating from an image by pressing 0 on your keyboard. If you aren't already working in grid view, press G on your keyboard to see all images. To see star ratings in this view, let's go to View, Grid View Style, Show Extras. Now we can see the star rating for every image in our library. One other way that you can add stars is actually by just clicking on the icon below an image thumbnail here in grid view. Here's what matters most. Be consistent in how you use this feature. Make sure that you reserve a given set of stars for images with similar qualifications. Save your 5 stars for maybe 5 or 10 favorite images for the entire year, for example. Reserve it for those really excellent images that you're ready to hang in a gallery. Once you've spent time adding star ratings, let's look at 2 ways to take advantage of them. Press T on your keyboard if you don't see the toolbar at the bottom of the library module. Let's click on Sort and then choose Rating. Now our images are sorted based on the star rating. What if we don't want to sort, but instead filter and find specific ratings? The quickest way to filter for star ratings is with this one at the lower right corner. The default option will filter images on a greater than or equal to basis. Just click the number of stars and you'll see all of the images that match that star rating. And by the way, you can change how this works by clicking on the symbol. We can actually show all images that are less than or equal to, or exactly equal to, as you're seeing me do here. Click the stars again to turn the rating filter off. It's your call how you want to rank your images. I've seen photographers who use stars to mean other things, like what stage in the edit process they're at. The important part is remembering that you can leverage this field to add more meaning to your image than your camera can on its own. We've spent the last few lessons leveraging some of the user-added metadata fields. By now, you're using and taking advantage of some of the fields like ratings, flags, color labels, and more. Now we're going to put it all together by showing you how to mix and match these filters to pinpoint files at a moment's notice. Again, this lesson will take place in the library module. Let's start off by pressing the # button on your keyboard. You'll see this library filter menu drop-down. I prefer to switch to the Metadata tab for the most power over my images. Okay, now you'll see these columns that allow you to filter in different ways. The basic idea here is that we're going to use some type of data about the image to find what we want. Best of all, these filters stack. Let's walk through an example. First, let's do a simple date example. We can click on any of these years to filter for the images in the year. The images below in our view are updated to match only what we're filtering for. One of my favorite things here is that you can also multi-select, and this is something we'll use throughout this lesson. Let's say that I want to select a few things. If I hold Command on my keyboard or Control on Windows, I can click on a few of these options and now they're all selected. That means that the images below can match any of the selections. So how about stacking filters? That means that we need it to meet rules from multiple categories in order to stay in scope. In any of these other filter panels, I can simply click on an additional piece of metadata. That doesn't wipe out our filter that we already selected. The way that this works is from left to right, and basically the filter at the left gets first priority. After we pick date, the other columns only show what will match. Now, the filters that you see here in the default view are handy, but we've only scratched the surface. Remember, Lightroom lets us filter on practically any field. So if I click the title on the drop-down at the top, I can change it to other fields I don't currently see. So if I wanted to select rating, it's as easy as clicking on it. Now we have that available as a filter field. You can always turn off a given filter by clicking back at the top of these columns. Let's do just a couple of examples so that you feel ready to use the feature yourself. Let's start off by first thinking about what we want to find. For example, I'll look for my favorite images with a high star rating shot with a wide-angle lens in 2020 or 2021. First, let's pinpoint based on date. I'm going to choose 2 years in the date field. Then I'm going to pull in lens in the next column. I'll pick the fairly wide focal lengths, this time shift plus clicking in a range. And finally, let's add rating to our available fields. In that case, I'll start off with just 4 or 5 stars. But you can always expand to include other ratings too in case you don't find enough images that match. Now you see the selection here of my top images with a wide angle across those 2 years. This is where it all comes together. You navigating your library quickly with the metadata you worked hard to add to the images. From here, you could easily select all of the images in this view and export them or apply any other function that Lightroom offers, like corrections. All of these features are powerful and it's easy to see the potential, but I also understand if it seems a little overwhelming to use all this data. Remember, we're just using the data to find the things that match the image we have in mind. So start with what you want to know and then think about the rules that help you find it. There's an art to curating images. The way that you put them together, sequence them, and show them off is a big part of the storytelling journey that we go on as photographers and editors. In Adobe Lightroom, we have a powerful tool for this called collections. They're virtual folders that don't move files around on a drive, but they do help you group and curate your images. Let's learn how to create a collection. Find the Collections panel on the left side, then click on the plus button. Let's choose Create Collection. If you already had your first image selected to add to the collection, leave this box ticked. Otherwise, just give it a memorable name that describes what's inside of it and click Create. Now, we've got a new space where we can add a completely custom set of images and then work with them in a custom separate space. Let's learn how to add images by first making it the target collection. Right-click on the collection title here on the left side and let's choose Set as Target Collection. Notice the plus sign added next to the collection name to help you see the active target collection. You'll see the power of this quick setup step in just a moment. Now, let's leave our nearly empty collection by jumping back to the library module. Now, everything is back in view and we're ready to select the images to add to our collection. You can just press B on your keyboard with any image selected to automatically send it to the target collection we just set. You can also drag and drop images to add them to a collection. Just click and drag a thumbnail on top of the collection name and now it's added. You can hold Command on your keyboard on Mac or Control on Windows and then click and drag images inside a collection. To see the images in the collection you've created, just click on it. Of course, if you decide an image doesn't fit with what you had in mind, you can always press B on your keyboard or right-click Remove from Collection. Press T on your keyboard to show the toolbar below. You can choose another sort method to try out other sequencing options for the images in a collection. Try out another option like sorting on file name or rating, for example. In a future lesson, I'm going to show you how to create a totally custom sequence here to help you tell the story the way you see it by sequencing the images in a custom mode. Working in the library module, you have all the controls you need to work with your images to create these custom collections. Images can belong to an unlimited number of collections, so use them for your own custom groups. Get creative with the collection. Spend some time daydreaming about how images might fit together and go beyond simple ideas like similar dates and locations. What about your favorite photos of images dominated by blue hues, for example? Start experimenting today and I bet you'll have fun with it. You already know that Lightroom metadata is powerful for exploring, tagging, and finding the images you need. Once you're familiar with metadata, your mind starts working differently. You start thinking of using something you know about an image to find what you're looking for. One of the best ways to do that is with smart collections. You set metadata rules and then you can always see the images that meet those rules. Collections are manually created while smart collections are automated. Let me show you how to use them to your advantage. In the Library module, find the Collections panel here on the left side. Collections are virtual folders. They don't change the way that files are arranged on your drive, but they let you virtually group them to work between them. Let's click the plus button and choose Create Smart Collection. This new window might just look like another menu, but stay with me here. It's really powerful. What we're going to do here is tell Lightroom what we're looking for and want to include in the Smart Collection. For example, we can say that an image needs to have a rating of 4 or greater to be included in the Smart Collection. Notice that you also have the option to not just look for images with a greater than or equal to rating, but you can choose other options like is a certain rating or is less than or equal to a rating. Let's add a second rule with the plus button. You can build rules on so much more than just the rating example we looked at. In the first column, click on the dropdown and you'll see that you have at your fingertips every bit of metadata that your image may contain. As an example, let's choose capture date and then let's choose is in the range for a range of dates. Let's bracket it for 2 dates, and what we're telling Lightroom to do is only include images that are within this window of dates. You can continue to add more rules until you have exactly what you want included in your Smart Collection. Just press the plus button and keep adding more metadata-based rules. Now, after you've built out a few rules, make sure that you choose between the match options. You can tell Lightroom that your Smart Collection includes all of the rules or any of the rules. Basically, do your images need to meet every rule, or is just meeting one of them enough? Think of it as how strict you want your match to be. Lastly, give it a name that helps you remember what's in the Smart Collection and you're ready to go. Click Create and you're taken to the Smart Collections window where you'll see the images that match. Of course, the magic is that this Smart Collection is always up to date. If you imported a new image tomorrow and it met the rules, returning to the Smart Collection would show you the new images that match. It's not a one-time query, it's an ongoing Smart Collection. Before you open the Smart Collections menu, try to think about what you're looking for, what types of images you'd like to be able to get at a moment's notice. Then build it out using the rules. Use Smart Collections to create a rules-based folder that's always up to date. Most of Lightroom's views will put your images in chronological order by default. That makes sense as we tend to think about photography as in sequence and following a timeline. But there are so many other ways to show images. The order that you show them in is a creative dimension that you might not have considered. In this lesson, you're going to see how to sequence them however you want. We've already created a collection in this course and I'm inside of it. Let's make sure that we have the toolbar showing by pressing T on our keyboard. One setting you might want to make sure you can see is the thumbnail size, and I'm going to pull it until I can see all of the images in my collection. Now let's start sequencing. All you really have to do is drag and drop images to put them in the order that you have in mind. As you drag an image thumbnail, you'll see this thick black line between the images that shows where the image is dragged to. When you release it, you'll see that it's in a new spot, and now we have a custom sequence. This sequence is saved until we change it. As you're seeing me do here, I'm moving images around into a totally custom sequence. Imagine showing these off while you give a talk about a photo trip or share images that tell a story. With a custom sequence, write your own narrative and don't feel locked to chronological order. So we've put images into a custom order, and the question becomes, how do we share them this way? Of course, one option would be to go into the slideshow module and kick off the slideshow in this order. For our example, what I want to do is show you how to export images with this same sequence. That gives you the order you want to use in any app. We haven't really seen how to export images in this course yet, but let's take a quick example. Let's start off by selecting all images with Command-A on macOS or Control-A on Windows to select them. This makes them all selected for the export that we'll do in just a moment. Let's right-click now and choose Export, Export from the menu. You'll learn more about some of these settings later, so let's focus on what's specific to exporting on a custom sequence. Let's tick a box and put it in a subfolder. Let's put in a custom name for the image folder as you're seeing me do here. Let's also tick the Rename To box. I'll choose Custom Name Sequence. The sequence part is the important one so that we keep them in the same order. We'll leave the start number set to 1 and press Export. This starts the image export, and now you'll see the folder where the finished images were saved to. You can see that they're numbered off in the same order as you see them visually in Lightroom. This means that you can simply flip through the folder with a preview app in the same order you see here, thanks to that sequential numbering. Most apps will support this numbering as well so that you can follow them in the same order that we set in Lightroom. Remember, sequencing is just another way that you can tell your story. Use this custom option inside a collection to show them off the way you want. There's nothing worse than redoing work from scratch. And in many cases, our images will share so much of the same details that we can take advantage of syncing the changes we've made. This lesson will focus on syncing metadata we've added to one image out to others. Let's learn how. I'm working in the library module, and let's say that I've got an image that I've already added all of the metadata that you saw in the earlier lessons to. And I know from looking at this image and the ones in sequence after that I can sync the metadata. That's because they have similar data around them. Let's start by selecting this image, then selecting others by holding Command on Mac OS or Control on Windows to select them all. The Sync Settings feature is used when you want to copy the visual settings of an image from one to another. That would include visual adjustments like exposure or contrast, for example. We'll cover that later, and for now, we're just going to sync metadata. Let's click on Sync and you'll see a new window pop open. This menu is basically asking you, what data do you want to take from your source image and apply to other images? It's common to take something like a rating or keyword and apply those to other images. The way that this menu works is this. For any of the settings, if you tick the box at the top of the section and press Sync, all images will receive the same metadata. There are many sections of metadata here, and you can sync up so much, like copyright status, the creator of the image's name, and so much more. So if I wanted all of the images to have the same rating, ticking this box with a rating selected is a good start. Press Synchronize and every image that you selected will now feature the same metadata in the selected section. The most common way that you'll use this menu is to sync keywords. Let's scroll to the very bottom and find the keyword section. With this box checked, pressing Synchronize will apply the keywords to every image in your selection. Now remember that when you use this feature, everything that you select is synced over. So if you're syncing keywords, be careful so that you don't share tags that don't apply to all of the images in the selection. Let's look at one more batch metadata change that's sure to help you out in a pinch, and it's basically like syncing settings between images. Let's say that your time wasn't set properly on your camera and all of the images are off on capture time. Instead of adjusting your images one by one, the best way to approach this is to adjust the capture time as a batch. With your images selected, let's go to the Metadata Edit Capture Time menu. This is a neat menu because it allows you to adjust all the images at once with an offset to the time. Let's use a simple example that assumes I just didn't change my camera after daylight savings time. I'm going to shift the selection by a set number of hours of just 1. Let's dial in a number of hours forward or backward here and press OK. Now, each image will be adjusted by the same amount so that you don't have to go one by one. This is another way of syncing your metadata settings for efficient, batch-friendly adjustments. Don't redo your metadata from scratch each and every time. It helps to sync over the settings that you know are shared from one image to the next with the help of these features. There's this thing that happens when beginners start using Lightroom. With so many controls and tools, they're tempted to just start pulling sliders and experimenting with every option inside the app. It's certainly fun to see your adjustments take effect in real time, but jumping from slider to slider can make your images messy and overly edited. Plus, without a process and a set of steps, you never really know when an image is actually finished. Of course, I agree that Lightroom is great to use, and post-processing is totally fulfilling, watching your images come to life toward a finished product. The key is to follow a set of steps in sequence. The way that we're going to approach this is by starting with basics. That means beginning with steps to correct our images, basically bringing them back to something similar to how you saw them in the real world. If you shoot in RAW, and you probably should, you'll notice that your images are going to come out of camera looking a bit flat. That means that they need a few adjustments just to get back into a normal range. One common adjustment for this is exposure. It's rare that your image is perfectly exposed, meaning that it might be too light or too dark overall. This is a great first step as part of the adjustment process to get an image back into range. Similar to this is the basic color settings in your image, which you can control with white balance. This sets the relative color settings to a neutral point. You're likely shooting in a variety of light sources, and the rendering of color is going to vary based on the color of the light. By setting the white balance, your image's color tones will all change. We'll also get more detailed with adjustments like detailed highlights and shadow adjustments. These are more specific and control exposure for a part of an image. These adjustments don't affect the entire image, only specific tonal ranges. Since most images aren't exposed flat across the frame, these are really helpful to capture the details the way that you pictured them. You'll also see other steps in the post-processing workflow that bring an image back to neutral. That includes other adjustments like contrast and cropping that help you represent an image the way that you had it in mind. These are some of the steps that you're going to learn in the upcoming lessons. We'll start with adjustments and then later on teach you to get creative. The first step is to bring images back to normal. With the right process, which is a set of structured steps that move in sequence, post-processing is not only efficient, but it's fun too. Remember to think about this as an orderly set of steps as we work through the next few lessons. In the intro to this section, we proposed a set of steps that you need to correct an image. Remember that corrections are what we do to get an image back to something like the real-life scene. In this lesson, I want to show you the very essentials of photo correction. It's a bite-sized look at how we approach the corrections process. The first step that we'll take on is correcting exposure. We're in the Develop module where all of these adjustments take place. In this case, I'm going to start off by just working with the exposure slider. In general, this image is a bit underexposed here in the foreground. One thing you might want to try while you're learning corrections is the Auto button. Just click on it and Lightroom will take a guess at how to correct the image. I'll go ahead and undo this with Command+Z. Now let's apply the adjustment to the underexposure by pulling up the exposure slider to the right. Now, you might have noticed that this image has a lot of tonal range, so we should think about adjusting the highlights and shadows at least somewhat independently. When I say that it has a lot of tonal range, that means that there's a lot of different shades in the image, like a lot of really bright areas and a lot of really dark areas. The building is really quite bright and overexposed, so I'm going to start off by pulling the white slider significantly to the left. Then I'll apply the same adjustment to the highlight slider, nearly all the way. We're bringing the dynamic range back to the image. I'll repeat the same steps in the opposite direction with shadows and black sliders, again dialing back in the detail into the frame. By adjusting these sliders, we're controlling separate parts of the image. When shooting in RAW, I typically also add back a bit of contrast by pulling that slider to the right. Images shot in RAW will typically come out a bit flat and need a bit of added contrast. This set of steps has really corrected the tone and contrast of the image to bring it back to the way the human eye sees the scene. Our eyes have a lot of dynamic range, and these adjustments again help us to see an image closer to real life. You can also use this correction step to apply a crop. When I press the R key on my keyboard, I have a crop overlay on the image that I can pull to select the part of the image to keep. When I press R and leave the crop grid, it locks in the finished image. I might even throw on just a bit of clarity here to bring out those edge details. Again, RAW images need a bit of extra sharpness to bring them back to life. But with just these clicks, we have a corrected image. We can get even more creative later on with more adjustments. These are just a sneak peek of the adjustments that you'll make in the next section. They're truly the essentials that take an image to a good enough state. We're going to explore each of these adjustments in detail through this section of the course, so make sure to stay tuned. Exposure is a true photo editing essential. It's the way that we adjust the overall lighting and brightness of an image. The term exposure comes from the days of film photography. When a camera shutter opens and light exposes film to the light, an image is formed. In the digital era, the idea is the same. When your shutter opens, light reaches your sensor and creates an image. Of course, it's filtering through the optical elements in a lens, but ultimately it's all about the exposure. The medium might have changed going from film to digital, but you're still creating an exposure. Here's the thing. There are many settings on your camera that you choose when you're creating an image, and each of them have an impact on exposure, like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. What's more is that your exposure isn't always perfect when you capture the image. In fact, this is an element that you're going to adjust in almost every image. You'll need to learn the essentials of adjusting exposure in post-production so that this part of your image works well. For the sake of this lesson, we've stuck to just one slider, the exposure slider. I'm working in the Develop module here. The easiest way to adjust exposure is to start off by letting Lightroom make a guess at how to adjust the image by pressing the Auto button here on the basic panel. It does move several sliders in the tone section, but it's a great way to get started. Lightroom is pretty smart at analyzing your image and guessing at how to apply these, so it's a helpful starting point. This course is really about making Lightroom work for us, and I want to encourage you to try this out first. If you don't like what Lightroom did with your images, feel free to undo the adjustments with a Command-Z on macOS or Control-Z on Windows to undo them. If you want to tackle this more manually, it's time to start working with the exposure slider. You can pull this slider to the left to reduce exposure or basically darken the image. Or you can pull it to the right to increase exposure. These adjustments always work better if your monitor is calibrated. That's a bit beyond the scope of this lesson, but it's helpful to know that there's a neutral point you can set your images to. What I like to do is press J on the keyboard so that you get warnings about clipping, which we'll talk more about in future lessons. As you start to pull the slider, it can show warnings of where you've pushed it too far with red warning areas. Now, the scope of this lesson will only touch the exposure slider. That means that the adjustments we apply will impact the whole image. With every adjustment in Lightroom, this is based on feel, so keep experimenting. By the way, there's something you should know as a photographer. First, you should already be shooting in RAW format. Your camera will actually capture more detail so that there's more room to adjust the exposure in post-production. You have more data captured, so that means you can pull out more information while adjusting the exposure. Also, it's better to underexpose an image instead of overexposing it when you're shooting. That means I'd rather have an image that's slightly too dark than one that's way too bright. An underexposed image is easier to pull back into range than the other way around. Remember, other sliders will affect the way that you perceive exposure. That means that while you apply adjustments like contrast, you might need to jump back and adjust the exposure slider further. Thanks to Lightroom's non-destructive image adjustments, you can keep making these changes without any loss of quality. This might seem like a simple adjustment dedicated to just one slider, but this lesson showed you just how important and nuanced it can be to dial in exposure. I personally recommend that this should always be the first step when you correct an image. We've already covered the basics of exposure adjustment in this section, but as always, there's more power to discover. When you need more control, you can turn to additional sliders that help us to recover detail. These controls are somewhat intuitive, but I want to show you how they work. Let's take this photo as an example because it needs highlight recovery after we apply the exposure adjustment. For just a moment, let's try an experiment. Press the J key on your keyboard, and you should see these boxes light up on top of the histogram in the corners. This gives us clipping indicators. That shows us when you've pushed your adjustments too far. When I pull the exposure slider all the way up, you'll see this scary red area, and that means that we've blown out all detail. That area of the image is so overexposed that there's no detail. Similar to that, all the way to the left with blue indicators shows that you're too far into black tonal ranges. It's also showing you that you've lost detail. This is a good guidepost while we start making adjustments. I like to start with this adjustment by setting the white point to the left. This is basically telling Lightroom to make an assumption about the widest or brightest point of an image. Pulling it to the left will bring more detail back to the brightest points of the image. That means that we're basically telling Lightroom to reinterpret the image's widest point. After that, you can start to dial in the highlights. I'm going to make a similar adjustment by pulling it to the left, and you'll see the highlighted areas of the image come back into play. That's the core of this lesson. We're recovering detail that was previously over or underexposed. By controlling the sliders independently, we're really commanding Lightroom how to control the exposure. Again, while we're doing this, we're watching for those clipping indicators on the image to pop out to warn us of going too far with adjustments. As I pull too far in a given direction on a slider, Lightroom warns us with those indicators. I'm also going to start bringing some detail back to the foreground here with a blacks and shadows adjustment. Pulling the black slider in this direction is telling Lightroom to recover the detail. And then I'll make a corresponding adjustment to shadows to dial the detail back in as well. With that, we've really brought much more balance back to the exposure and increased the dynamic range by adding more tones. Remember that the exposure slider controls the exposure of the entire image. In contrast, these other adjustments are more targeted and control specific tonal ranges. So far, we've been focused on corrections like exposure. You might be wondering when we tackle how we perceive and view color in an image, and this lesson on correcting white balance is our first step. White balance is what the camera interprets as a reference point for what is white in an image. Based on setting that white balance point, the camera's interpretation of every other hue follows. If you shoot in challenging lighting conditions, you're sure to capture images that need white balance correction. Sure, you can use a card to set that reference point while shooting, but that just isn't practical in many situations. Let's take an example here. I'm going to find this slider labeled Temp here on the Develop module in the Basic panel. You can pull it to the left to set a more blue-white point and to the right for warmer tones. Remember, we're still just correcting, so keep these adjustments neutral to where the image appears natural. There's also a tint slider for green and magenta trade-offs. It takes some time to get this dialed in, and I always like to press Y on my keyboard to see the before and after. That helps me to ensure that I'm not taking my adjustments too far. Now, other than eyeballing this adjustment, you can also use my favorite tool, the eyedropper, also called the white balance selector. I'm going to click on the tool, then find a white point on the image and click on it. From that point, Lightroom is using it as a reference point to correct all hues in the image. If you have a white point, I think this is the best way to correct white balance. It takes the correction from being a guessing game with many factors to more of a science. Sometimes the dropper won't work because the exposure isn't quite right. You can see an example here. That's because those highlights are actually a bit blown out, and therefore it can't use that as a reference point. It's not actually white, there's no detail there at all. In that case, you'll either need to find another point for the eyedropper or go back to using the guesstimate method we looked at first. It helps to have a calibrated monitor, which is a bit outside the scope of our course. Make sure to look into getting an inexpensive device you clip to your monitor to set the reference point on as well. Every panel is different, and I don't want you to be surprised when your favorite images appear radically different on other devices or in print. Calibrating brings everything to a norm. Here's one important point. Don't use the white balance slider to apply creative color tinting. Lightroom really has so many tools for that purpose, and white balance just isn't the right one. That's because it adjusts everything all at once. When we're getting creative, we want more precision, and I'll teach you to do exactly that later on. White balance is an important part of the correction process so that color appears the way we remembered it. Use these easy white balance tweaks as one of the most important correction steps. We've been working on adjusting exposure in several lessons in this section, but what I want to dedicate this lesson to is defining and reviewing how to correct tone and contrast. We're going to use many of the same tools, but maybe you'll think about them in new ways. First, let's talk about what tone and contrast really are, and this image with 2 edits applied to it is a great example. I have this black and white image with 2 different versions. I would say the left copy is more like a correction, and the right copy is a creative edit where the contrast has been increased. They illustrate how an adjusted image can vary in tone and contrast. The edit on the left is lower contrast, while the image on the right is high contrast. Tonal range is all about that dynamic range in the image. Notice how in the left copy, even though the various objects and parts of the frame are different shades of gray, they're all somewhat similar. For example, the pants are certainly darker than the vest in the left copy, but there's really not that much of a difference. That's because the tonal range is somewhat compressed. It has lower dynamic range. The edit on the right is high contrast. The sky and highlight areas are pure white, while the darkest areas of the image are pure black. That expanded tonal range with high contrast is a great example of the difference because you can see that the image takes on such a range of shades. The left image is really rendered in ranges of middling grays, while the right image is contrasty. Now remember, we're still talking about corrections, so as we switch back to look at an edit of our own, let's learn to correct it. When you shoot in RAW, your images need contrast correction because the default RAW file is somewhat uninterpreted. Remember, this course is about making Lightroom work for you, and I like to keep things simple when it comes to correcting tone and contrast. I lean on the tone curve and the presets built into it. On the tone curve, I simply tend to choose one of the built-in presets like medium contrast. That's really all it takes to add back a reasonable amount of contrast to a level that corrects the image. The edits you saw earlier are more creative contrast adjustments, and I included the example just to learn to talk about the terms. In most cases, a simple preset on the tone curve is enough. But what if you need just a bit more control in correcting contrast? For example, you might have a specific image where one specific tonal range, like the highlights or shadows, needs more adjustment. Maybe your camera didn't have the dynamic range reach of its own to really get the detail you need. When you're working with the tone curve for contrast, I want to teach you a trick. You might already know that this is one way to make adjustments to exposure. However, it's kind of an advanced tool, and it doesn't take long before you're pulling it in a way that changes an image unexpectedly. When we're using the tone curve for exposure, try out holding the Shift key as you make an adjustment. This locks your mouse cursor to only be able to pull it up or down. The tone curve can get a bit funky when we start changing its fundamental shape by dragging it left to right, so this is a good way to keep the adjustment simpler. It helps to adjust the exposure for a specific tonal range, like shadow ranges on the left and highlight ranges on the right. In my mind, this helpful keyboard shortcut puts some meaningful guides on the tone curve instead of letting you over-adjust. With these adjustments, you have plenty of capability to correct tone and contrast. I've always said that Lightroom gives us multiple tools to accomplish similar tasks. And while you've already learned how to adjust exposure in a number of ways, there's still another precise method that I want to show you. This involves a keyboard shortcut that's really handy. In the Develop module, we're going to work with the tone sliders like exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. We'll use a keyboard command when we click and drag on the sliders to help us learn more about how our adjustments are affecting the image. On Mac OS, we're going to use the Option key, while Windows will use the Alt key. Let's start off with a test on the highlights. As I hold the keyboard shortcut down and start dragging either the highlights or white slider, the screen will turn black. And as I drag it, you'll see eventually that some detail starts to pop out. Now, what Lightroom is showing us with this unique type of display is basically the areas that we've pushed too far. It's the areas of the image that are blown out once we pull the slider to the spot we've selected. Think of this as the point at which you've gone too far with your adjustment. You've lost detail from the original image. One way that I like to think about this shortcut is as a way to push the image to its limits without losing detail. Basically, we can pull on these sliders with this showing until we hit those indicators. And of course, pressing J to turn on the clipping indicators after we leave this mode will always show a similar warning. This black screen overlay is what you'll see when we work with highlights and whites. And there's a similar view when you're working with shadows and blacks. Hold the same Option key on Mac or Alt key on Windows and begin to pull the sliders. This time, the screen is mostly white, and pushing the adjustment too far starts to pop out as well with these colorful areas. This means that the adjustment goes too far in the shadow direction and all detail is lost. Again, it's another way that you can use Lightroom's indicators to warn you when an adjustment is overdone. One other helpful shortcut while you're working with any precise controls in the tone panel is to reset an adjustment we've applied. This actually works on any Lightroom slider, and all we need to do is double-click on the slider point in order to reset it to 0. When your adjustments have gone a bit far, this is a good way to bring things back to norm. While you're still thinking about exposure, there's a powerful type of adjustment I want to show you. The histogram in the upper right corner of the Develop module is another way that you can actually make adjustments. The shape of this curve actually is a visual indicator of the exposure, and it's not just a random shape rendered by your camera. Parts of the curve actually control specific parts of the image's tonal range. To adjust the image, just click and drag to shift the histogram. If you're more visually inclined, this is a powerful way to edit an image. Each of the sections corresponds to a slider in the tone panel. It's just another way to make an adjustment. Both of these are techniques that you should keep in mind when you're editing a real image masterpiece. Sure, you might not need this type of precision every day, but when it matters, it matters. In this lesson, we're going to talk about correcting saturation. Saturation describes the intensity of the hue of a color. See here for the difference between a highly saturated blue and a desaturated blue. Lightroom gives us a lot of control to adjust these independently. Now, a lot of people think of saturation as a tool that's more of a creative adjustment, and it can certainly be that. But it's also a corrective tool, and here's why. If you're shooting in RAW format, your images aren't ready for prime time when you import them. They're flat and lack color versus the real-world rendering, like in this image. To adjust saturation, let's find the saturation slider in the Develop module and pull it to the right. You can see that the intensity of every hue turns up a notch. Blues are bluer, greens are greener, and it's just generally bringing more color to the image. Now, there's a reason that saturation isn't one of our first elements that we correct. Other sliders have an effect on the perception of saturation, like adjusting the contrast slider, for example. And you really can't dial in saturation until you make changes that we already have to areas like white balance. Otherwise, you're chasing a moving target. You're setting color and then trying to adjust how much saturation comes to it, but it's important that you go in the right sequence. In many cases, I find that by the time I've applied other adjustments, I don't need a saturation tweak at all. But it's still good to know about the tool. I'm going to reset my saturation adjustment by double-clicking on it. There's another slider that's typically used for creative adjustments, and it's called Vibrance. Let's remember that for now, we're working on correcting the image, bringing it back to its real-world perception. But let's give it a try for the sake of experimentation. When you pull on Vibrance, what I find is that it leaves alone the already saturated areas and instead brings more saturation to the less noticeable parts of the image. I think it can be a helpful corrective tool for certain hues. Like many sliders in Adobe Lightroom, it's one of those things that you have to try out for yourself to get a feel for. If you have overly muted hues in the image, maybe try the vibrant slider first. The important part is to periodically take a step back from the image you're working on and ensure that you haven't turned up the colors to nuclear levels. We'll talk a bit more about these adjustments in our creative section, but there's one section that I want to turn your attention to while we learn how to correct saturation. Let's find the HSL panel, and that's short for hue, saturation, and luminance. It allows you to control the saturation of each color. As an example, I'll adjust the blue hues here to bring some color back to an undersaturated area of the image. It's easy to overdo it with these sliders, and like I said, we're still focused on corrections. We'll have some more fun with these later, but if you ever had a hue that was almost underrepresented in the image, keep this in mind. As an example of when this might come in handy, many cameras actually don't render the color purple quite true to life, and this tool gives you the proper corrections. Are there ever situations where you need to reduce saturation? Well, it would be rare for a raw image, but I can imagine photos where a filter over the lens or some other interfering source causes you to need that. In that case, you can of course pull the saturation or vibrance sliders a bit to the left to bring the colors back into a correct range. Saturation is a great way to bring your colors to life more like the real world. Remember that we're approaching this as a correction, so don't overdo it, but don't hesitate to play with these sliders either. After all, it's non-destructive and you can always undo it. Composition is everything in photography. It's the art of how we arrange a frame and capture the subjects in it. That doesn't just mean posing either, it's how we position even landscapes and still objects by moving our feet and changing the lens. And what you might not have considered is that there's a second composition that takes place when you're working in Lightroom using the crop tool. When we crop in post-production, we have a chance to alter the composition of a frame further. Let's learn how to crop in Adobe Lightroom. We're working in the Develop module here, and let's select a single image to get started. The way that I start this process is by pressing the letter R on the keyboard. You'll see a new overlay pop onto the image, and this is the crop grid that shows the area of the image that you'll see after you crop it. Basically, it's going to show you what's left over after you leave the crop tool. The first step that I like to take is to correct tilt in an image if it isn't already level. There are two ways to do this. One way is to place your cursor on the edge of the image until you see this double arrow. You can click and drag to rotate the image a few degrees until it's straight. It's a good idea to eye something horizontal in the image like a straight line and then tilt the image accordingly. Another way to do this is to grab the ruler and draw the horizontal line so that Lightroom follows the same slope. Click on the ruler here with the crop rectangle open and draw it along a horizontal line. Lightroom will use this as a level line to tilt the image along it. Now that our image is nice and level, let's adjust the crop area. The easiest way to use this is to grab the handle of the image and drag it to adjust the selected crop area. This is the area that's remaining after you leave the tool. You can also click and drag to set the area that you'll crop an image to, as you're seeing me do here. Once you have your area selected, press R to leave the tool and lock in your crop. Let me take this time to remind you that Lightroom's adjustments are non-destructive. That means that you can crop, recrop, and readjust. Press the R key anytime to reopen the crop area and keep adjusting until you have the perfect composition. You might have noticed while you have this tool open that the crop tool feels a bit sticky, so to speak. It's kind of snapping and keeping the same shape to the crop area as the original image. With this lock icon that you see here, Lightroom is locking what's called the aspect ratio, or basically the same shape as the original image. This is helpful for purposes like printing and really just preserving that original aspect ratio. You can always unlock it and create a freeform crop that doesn't really conform to any specific shape and just drag it around to your discretion. Another great option is to use one of the preset crop aspect ratios here if you want to get creative. Let's try a 1:1 crop, for example, if we wanted to share a square-shaped image. This changes the crop area to a square, and now you can set the image appropriately. Try out many of these crop options to fit a certain size print, for example. As you crop, keep this in mind. You're trimming off pixels from the original image. That might mean that you're cutting it down to a smaller size that's smaller than the way you want to export it, like for a super large print, for example. It helps if you have a high megapixel camera with more resolution so that you have plenty of extra pixels to crop to. There's one last thing that I want to show you, and it can be a lot of fun when you're experimenting. With the crop overlay turned on, press the O key on your keyboard for new crop overlays. These are invisible grids that you can use for composing an image. You might have heard, for example, of the rule of thirds that states to place the interesting parts of an image on the intersection. Or check out this golden rule crop overlay rooted in magic mathematics. Try these out and place the action of the image on the lines for an experiment in creative composition. As you can see, so much control over your image can happen in post-processing. You can truly recompose photos after shooting them with the help of cropping in Lightroom. Throughout this section of the course, we've been working with images one by one. Correcting image after image is just too time-consuming, and ultimately the work of editing them will mean that you probably won't do it at all. So now we'll learn batch processing. This is the way that we take the adjustments, apply them at scale, and edit more images in less time. There's a few ways to batch process images, and we'll cover those techniques in this video. First up, let's make sure that we're working in the Develop module. I have an active image here in the workspace, and I've already done all of the adjustments and corrections to it. What follows on the film strip down here is a series of other images that are all similar. They're similar in image content, exposure before the edit, and many other factors. That means that we can probably reuse the edit that we've already completed, at least as a starting point. So what if we could just take the edits we've already applied and push them onto other images in our library? Well, that's exactly what we'll do. With that in mind, what I'm going to do is stay on the active image and then select similar ones. On my keyboard, I can hold Shift and click the last image in a sequence that's similar. Another way you could do this is with Control-click on Windows or Command-click on Mac to select images to jump around and select them all over the place. Either way, once you have your images selected, make sure you're still on the active one, and then let's find this Sync button and click on it. Okay, we've got a new window, and it's time to make some decisions about how we apply our edits to other images. This window basically shows the list of every possible adjustment in Lightroom that we might have already made. What I like to do is only leave the boxes checked that I think work well across multiple images. That means that we would omit things like local adjustments and spot corrections. After all, those are likely to vary from one image to the next. But when it comes to adjustments like exposure and contrast, those are going to be about the same for a similar set of images. It's best to skip local adjustments and leave most others checked. Tick the boxes that you want to apply to the images in your selection. Like I mentioned, this works best with the more general adjustments that we've made. I'm going to press Synchronize, and now you'll watch the other images transform to include the adjustments as well. Syncing settings makes it really easy to process a bunch of images at once. That's it. With just a few clicks, we've automated a lot of the work that it takes to apply adjustments. Remember not to get overwhelmed at the thought of editing and correcting every single image in a shoot. It really only requires adjusting a few key reference images, then applying it to others. Let's take a look at other ways to apply batch processing adjustments. Similar to syncing settings, we can also pick up and paste an image adjustment onto another image. With an image selected, I'll press Command-C on macOS or Control-C on Windows to copy the adjustments that I've already applied. You'll see a pop-up window that's similar to the Sync Settings window. Again, it's a listing of every possible adjustment that you might apply to your images. Tick and untick the sections that you want to include in your copied settings. You could make this as simple as just picking up your exposure adjustments or keeping most of the settings that you've adjusted as part of the copy. By the way, there are situations where you could move the local adjustments from one image to the next if the images are almost exactly the same. Think about studio portraits shot just a few milliseconds apart. In that case, your local adjustments may actually be okay. In any case, I've adjusted my settings here to only pick up what I had in mind to extend to other images. Then I can move on to another image here on the film strip. Now, all I have to do is press Ctrl-V or Command-V on my keyboard to paste the adjustments to the selected image. They've been added and the image is transformed as you can see. Copy and paste those settings to save time. Another way that you can lock in some of your favorite adjustments is by creating presets. Presets are these infinitely reusable sets of settings that you can save and apply with a single click. After you adjust an image, let's find the presets panel here on the left side. Let's click on the plus button and choose Create Preset. Yet again, we've got a window to help us select the settings that we want to include. Let's start by giving it a name, then toggling off and on any setting that we wish to include. Basically, we're creating a group of settings that we can use now and in the future as well. I'll click Create, and now we'll see the name added to the Presets panel. Let's apply it to an image by first selecting one and then clicking on the preset name here in the sidebar. It's applied to our image and it carries through the settings we included. It's as easy as that. It's still going to take some time to dial in the specifics of each photo, but these steps give you a great starting point when it comes to adjustments. With batch processing techniques, you can work through a shoot of any size with less work than you ever thought possible. Make sure to keep these in mind so that you aren't constantly recreating the wheel when adjusting your photos. You're now a master of the art of image corrections. That means that you have all the skills that it takes to bring an image back to a real-world state. But now, it's time to flex your creative muscle with more creative adjustments. The first thing that I want to teach you about is creative contrast adjustments, and the tool that I like to use to do that is the tone curve. It's a visual representation of the tone of an image. You'll find it on the right side of the Develop module here. Given that we've already made corrections, we're ready to make some fine-tune adjustments for creativity. The easiest way to start to understand how this works is by trying out one of the presets and watching how the shape of the curve changes. Let's try out medium contrast. Notice that it takes on a decidedly more curvy shape, and that's how contrast is added. With an S-shaped curve, we add contrast back to an image. This tone curve is actually a click and control tool that alters the image when we adjust it. For one more example, we'll change to strong contrast, and that curve gets even steeper. Remember that Lightroom gives us many tools to make adjustments, and this is just really a visual way to make the contrast adjustments that we can also make with other sliders. The way that the tone curve control works is that the left side controls shadowed areas while the right side controls highlighted areas. One example of a creative adjustment is what you're seeing me do here, which is to grab the control points on the curve and crush the shadows by pulling them up. By pulling the tone curve up on the left side, I'm basically shifting the black point and dropping out contrast. If an S-shaped curve adds contrast, well, this flatter curve removes it. Basically, by flattening out that low-end point, we're reducing the black and shadows. Conversely, I can do the same with the highlight end of the curve to drop the highlight and white ranges out. This adjustment to flatten out the tone curve is a film-like style. That's because it takes on an almost faded, low-contrast style like many classic films did. Now, the second part of our lesson here will center around the precise color controls that you need to control your image, and that takes place on the HSL or color panel. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance, and we can control each of those independently in an image. And what's more, we can control each of the color tones independently. Let's take an example. With one specific color selected, we have 3 sliders that we can work with. We can start by looking at a hue shift. This actually shifts the color slightly, as you can see me doing here. This is available for any of the colors, and you can see me continue to experiment by shifting that hue around. It's a great way to take a specific hue and alter it to another one easily. After the hue slider, let's experiment with the saturation slider. This controls the intensity of each color. By increasing or decreasing the saturation slider, you'll watch the intensity of that selected color adjust accordingly. I love this adjustment to emphasize or de-emphasize the colors that can really carry the photo. While Lightroom offers general vibrance and saturation sliders, this gives us so much more precision and allows us to control each color specifically. Finally, the luminance slider adjusts the brightness of a specific hue. Basically, you can adjust this slider so that a specific hue is more or less exposed than the starting point. You might have learned how to control the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks already, but what if you could control it by color? Well, that's exactly what the luminance slider does for you. Each of these adjustments help you to creatively style your images. Now, I want to be clear about how to approach these adjustments. I can't recommend just playing with them randomly on each image. Sure, it's important to experiment as you learn your own style. But at the end of the day, we have these tools to help us bring our vision to life. If you just jump between them and use them haphazardly, your image will reflect that. Instead, as you really learn what you like as an editor, try to visualize how you want the image to appear, then think about the adjustments that you'll need to dial in accordingly. With these 2 additional tools in mind, it's easy to see how your creativity can begin to take center stage in Adobe Lightroom. Remember to start by visualizing how you want the final image to appear, then go to work with the tools. In this course, you've learned a bit about the tone curve, which is often used to manage contrast. And you also learned about precise color controls with the HSL panel. Now, it's time to yet again learn an alternate way to apply adjustments in Adobe Lightroom with the help of color curves. On the tone curve in the Develop module, you might not have noticed that there are 3 additional options for how we can work with it, with red, green, and blue color circles. Each of these can help us control the colors in our image. Let's start by clicking on red as an example. Notice that the shading in the curves gives us a clue of how moving the curve might affect the image. The left side of the curve is red, while the right side is shaded to blue. As a quick example, we can grab the middle area and begin to pull it. It's tinting the entire image really with the hues that we're dragging it towards. In many ways, I think this curve is more intuitive to use than a typical tone curve because you can follow the color guides. Now, remember how this tone curve works from our earlier lessons. The left side of the curve controls the shadows. When we're working in a color tone curve, pulling this side of the curve tints the shadows to one end of the color spectrum. Pulling it in the other directions shifts that same tonal range to the opposite color direction. The way that I work with this is to think about if I want to tint the whole image, the highlights, or the shadows. Then I grab the area I want to tint and move it toward the desired color to adjust the image accordingly. As an example, you could easily move the shadows to red. Now, you can check out some of the other color curves here. Let's switch to the green swatch and you'll see a green to magenta tone curve. It works exactly the same as the one you've already seen, so adjust it accordingly. It's fun to work with complementary color tints, like if you tint the highlights to magenta and shadows toward yellow hues. Last up, the blue swatch will give you the blue-yellow trade-off. Again, you can move the entire curve for overall tinting or control the shadows and highlights independently. The left side will tint shadows while the right side controls the tinting of the highlights. The color curves give you yet another tool to apply tinting and creative color to your images. Remember this tool if you want to adjust the image. Black and white conversions are consistently some of my favorite photo adjustments. Lightroom makes it easy to do that, but what you may not know is that it also gives you a ton of options for how to convert it to black and white. After all, there's not just one black and white conversion. There are so many styles, and in this video, I'll teach you how to create them yourself. When you're working in the Develop module, my first recommendation is to start off by creating a virtual copy of your image. This gives you a separate copy of the image to try out and experiment with creative adjustments. You'll see a new thumbnail here. Now, let's start off by converting the image to a basic black and white. At the top of the Basic panel in the Develop module, click on Black and White to start the conversion process. You'll see your image shift to a black and white version. It's worth noting that all of your existing correction adjustments are preserved. Much of the creative freedom that you harness in black and white conversions comes down to tonal adjustments. After all, you get to decide if you want a high contrast image or something more flat as one example. You can start to adjust with that in mind with the contrast slider as well as the 4 detailed exposure sliders. This is just the beginning of our adjustments, however. Let's scroll down and find the B&W panel. This might seem a bit unintuitive to see color sliders in a black and white conversion, but with a bit of experimentation, it begins to make sense. Each of these are exposure adjustment controls for specific hues. By pulling on a specific one, you'll see the exposure of that hue change. This is how you can get really creative with your black and white adjustments. You're working with modifying how each color range, if it were still in color, would appear. For example, the green slider will adjust the tone of the formerly green hues. You can see that black and white conversion still gives you so much creative freedom. Now, all of these are the detailed adjustments that we can make on our own, but this course is all about leveraging Lightroom to our advantage. One thing that I want you to try out is the black and white profiles that are built into Adobe Lightroom. Scroll back up and click on the profile browser. Find the B&W section and try out a few of these pre-built options. You can click on them to transform your images. You can also use the amount slider. That adjusts the intensity of how the adjustments convert the image to black and white. It's a great way to see a range of black and white styles without doing all of the work yourself. Now, if you want to try out more black and white styles, don't forget about Envato Elements. It's the all-you-can-download creative marketplace where you can get everything for one flat fee. There's a ton of black and white Lightroom presets included as part of your Elements subscription. Download a preset, add it to Lightroom, and try out all of these black and white styles easily. Don't forget all of these tools as a way to get really creative the next time you convert to black and white. A couple of times in this course, I've given you a sneak preview of the Adjustment Brush, a tool that helps you modify only a selected part of an image. Too many photographers think that Adobe Lightroom doesn't support localized adjustments, and so they wind up using Photoshop instead. And while Lightroom doesn't work on a pixel grid like Photoshop does, it does give you plenty of power to make local adjustments to a region of an image. Let's start off by ensuring that we're working in the Develop module. Then find the Adjustment Brush tool below the histogram here on the right side. When we click on this tool, you'll see the settings unfold, and it's important to note that this is a set of Lightroom sliders that's specific to the adjustment brush that we're setting up. Basically, you're going to load up the adjustments to apply to the brush. Let's also notice that there are presets here for adjustment brush settings. These give you a great starting point with many of the sliders dialed in for you. Opening the menu, let's do a quick example by choosing the Burn or Darken option and start brushing on the image. You can see the effects pretty quickly here as an easy example. Let's go ahead and undo that with the Command or Control-Z. Let's make sure that we have the toolbar showing below our image area. Press the T on your keyboard to show the toolbar. I like to tick the Show Selected Mask Overlay option. When you start brushing over an area of the image, you'll see the image light up with this reddish pink tint. Now, that reddish pink tint isn't the adjustment we're applying. It's just showing you what part of the image you're applying it to. You can toggle the mask off and on by pressing the letter O on your keyboard as well. What I like to do is start by visualizing the part of the image that I want to adjust, brush in the selection, and then apply the slider adjustments. As you're brushing onto the image, you may be wondering how we adjust the way the brush works, like the size and the hardness of the edges on it. Use the size slider here to change that brush size. You can dial this into exactly the size you need to apply your adjustments. Also, remember that you can always zoom in on your image using the navigator here in the upper left corner if you're really trying to be precise about where you apply the adjustment. Another way that alters how this brush works is by changing the feather setting. Notice with the high feather setting that the edges of the brush area are pretty open-ended. As I click and drag onto the image, it covers a wider area with a bit of feathering without a ton of precision. If you want to feather out your adjustment and not make the edges of it too harsh, this is a great idea. What I like to do is keep this at a mid to relatively high level so that the adjustments aren't too blocky on the edges. Basically, it gives you some fall off so that it's not too harsh in where the adjustment starts and ends. A lower setting applies hard edges, which is important though if you really want to control what part of the image is impacted by the adjustment brush. Again, what I like to do is brush in my adjustments first, then play with the sliders. Let's walk through an example. Let's say that I'm going to start by brushing onto this image here, and I know it needs some adjustment to bring it to life. I'll start with a mid-level mask feather setting and brush it onto the part of the image I want to adjust. I'm starting with the mask overlay turned on to see which parts of the image I'm covering. Now, it's just a matter of dialing in my settings here on the adjustment brush panel. I can pull each slider to give it the look and feel that I need. I'm going to toggle off the mask overlay as I'm doing this so that I can see the actual impact on the visuals in the image. This is another adjustment that's non-destructive, so I can always come back to it later and apply more adjustments as needed by reopening the adjustment brush. If you need to remove your adjustment brush changes, just click on the control point here and then press delete on your keyboard. It's removed from the image and now is unchanged. Start dreaming a bit about how you can use the adjustment brush to your advantage. Remember that basically any adjustment can be applied to a localized area with this setting. Noise is something you're bound to encounter in the editing stage sooner or later. It's probably because you've increased the ISO setting on your camera to take in more light in challenging low light situations. That increases the sensitivity and gives you more stops of exposure. And while film photos shot on high ISO film were kind of charming in their rendering of the grain, digital noise just isn't the same effect. It can be ugly and distracting. So what do we do? Well, we use Lightroom's amazing tools to help us reduce the presence and the visibility of this noise. Let's find the detail panel here on the right side in the Develop module. What I like to do when working with noise reduction is first zoom in more in general here on the navigator. It's best to work with the image in fit view so that it's all on screen. Then what I like to do is click on this icon and set it to a noisy area of the image for a 100% view at zoomed in levels. What we're really doing here is ensuring that we keep an eye on how this adjustment affects the overall image. Sometimes when we're reducing noise, we will soften the image up too much and lose some of the precious details that we want. This set of noise reduction sliders has everything we need to reduce the visibility of noise in our images. Let's watch this noise reduce as we pull up the luminance setting. This course is all about making Lightroom work for us, so here's my secret to save time. Typically, the only slider I'm adjusting is the luminance one. Frankly, it's too complex and time-consuming to study the trade-off between each of these sliders. The only other one that I sometimes will pull on is the color slider, because we sometimes get this nasty noise that's red, blue, and green, and a bit of color adjustment on the slider will help you to reduce it. Make sure that you also consider how some adjustments you apply will have an effect on noise. For example, cranking up the sharpening and clarity is also going to sharpen that noise and actually bring it more to the forefront. If your image is already noisy, you might have to forego some of the sharpening so that you don't accentuate the wrong details. Another one of my favorite techniques is to apply noise reduction to targeted areas. Many times, noise will show up in darker areas of the image, and not every part of the image will need that reduction. With the help of the adjustment brush, we can do just that, and it's another way that we can preserve detail while removing noise. I've opened the adjustment brush, and what I typically will do is use this pre-built effect for noise reduction. I'm going to go to a noisy area of my image and just start painting over it to apply the reduction to a selected area. You can use the noise slider here to adjust how much noise you want to remove, just as we did before. It's the best of both worlds to reduce noise and not impact detail. With a bit of adjustment, noise is no match for Lightroom's reduction capabilities. Make sure to use these tools to your advantage when an image is distractingly noisy. As photographers, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to draw focus to parts of an image. But there's another side to the equation too. When we de-emphasize parts of a photo, it brings focus to another area. Let's learn how to do that. One popular tool to de-emphasize parts of an image is to work with a tool like Clarity. Normally, we're pulling this slider to the right to enhance our details. In this case, let's consider the fact that as I pull it left, the image gets noticeably softer and more ethereal. Sometimes an image doesn't need perfectly sharp details. Maybe we want it to feel more airy and almost painting-like. With a negative adjustment, we're de-emphasizing the details so that in this case, the whole of the image shines. In many images, it's not ideal to adjust all parts of the image equally. We want some details to be more noticeable and others to fade into the background. I think that the best way to work with these types of adjustments is with the adjustment brush. Let's click on the adjustment brush and choose Clarity here. Remember that this is a tool that helps you adjust an area of an image. Let's dial the clarity adjustment down so that we have a negative adjustment teed up. I've identified the parts of the image that I wish to de-emphasize, and brushing over those areas will make the details less present. That means that these are less noticeable and other details come more into focus. Basically, by de-emphasizing, we let other parts of the image take center stage. Here's another way that you can de-emphasize parts of an image, and that's by modifying the rendering of color in an image. In this case, one thing that I like to do is de-emphasize details by adjusting saturation. The goal in my image edit workflow isn't to make every color equally present and vibrant, it's to let the most important hues that I decide on shine. Let's find the HSL color panel here in the Develop module. I'm going to select a given hue here and begin to adjust the saturation down. When that happens, you watch the image transform in real time. When a color is less saturated, it's only natural that you'll notice it less. What I like to do in most of my edits is decide on my focus hues and make sure that those are vibrant and present, and dial down the ones that I feel like don't add as much to the image. Thanks to the HSL panel, you can see that each hue is an independently adjustable variable. Again, all of the adjustments in this lesson have the same basic idea in mind. By de-emphasizing parts of an image, we bring more focus to other parts. There's one more technique that I want to show you to adjust emphasis. That's working with what's called the vignette, and that's a way to alter the edges of an image. Let me show you an example. Let's start by finding the effects panel near the bottom of the Develop module here on the right side. In the post-crop vignetting section, pulling the amount slider to the left will add a vignette to the image. You'll notice that the edges are getting darker, which naturally leads the eye to the center of the frame. When we use a post-crop vignette, we're really de-emphasizing the edges of the photo by darkening them. That naturally redirects the viewer's attention to the center of the frame. De-emphasize the edges, redirect attention, and the viewer's focus automatically shifts. Make sure when you use this adjustment that you don't double up with the vignetting that your camera lens naturally adds. There's fall off on the edges naturally built into many lenses. This is something that most photographers will correct with the lens corrections panel. What I like to do is enable profile corrections to fix the camera added vignette, then dial in my own adjustment with the effects panel. With these adjustments, we've brought emphasis to the right parts of an image and de-emphasized other parts. Keep techniques like detail adjustments, color, and vignetting in mind. As we've learned throughout this course, the number of image controls that Lightroom includes is truly impressive. There's a slider for every visual adjustment, and you can control every element of an image. I hope that this course has given you what you need to modify and style your images in ways you never thought possible. I want to encourage you to start thinking about what you like when you're editing images. What defines your style? What are the adjustments you find yourself making over and over again? The process of becoming a skilled editor includes a lot of experimentation, but I'll bet that you settle into some go-to adjustments that you make over time. Try this experiment with me. If you follow photographers on social media, try to open your favorite app, start scrolling, and don't look at the username of the poster. Try to guess the photographer while you're doing this. If you've been following them for some time, I'll bet that you can guess more than you might expect. That might be because of the content matter, but it's also because of the edits and style. This is what I call a signature look. It's the way that you shoot and edit your images in a way that becomes identifiable over time. It's those adjustments that not every photographer is making, those things that set your style apart. Every possible adjustment under the sun has already been made, but some photographers have those go-tos that they apply consistently so that it's instantly recognizable. The way that you mix and match your favorite adjustments helps form your signature style. So, how do you form your signature look? Well, I think it comes down to mindfulness about the types of adjustments you're making most frequently. When you start thinking about it, you start to peel apart those adjustments that you enjoy making, the ones that are taking your image to the next level and over the finish line when editing. So many of the correction adjustments that we made earlier in this course are not likely to be part of a signature look. They're just neutral adjustments. But those creative adjustments we make become part of the signature look that sets us apart. I tend to think of adjustments around color and the tone curve as two of the most popular ways to make stylistic choices that play into the signature look. Here's another tip. See if you can recreate the signature look of your favorite photographers. Sure, it might seem counterintuitive to borrow a signature look from someone else, but here's the thing. Reverse engineering an image edit teaches you how that photographer is going about their process from start to finish. You're seeing how they approach the process and getting an appreciation for how slider adjustments fit together. Then you're sure to find insight into how adjustments of your own can come together into a signature style. Another way that you can tap into developing your style is by learning from other photographers by using Lightroom presets. These are available through sites like Envato Elements, an all-you-can-download marketplace for creative adjustments. When you apply a preset, it shifts all of the sliders for you. Watching those sliders change and reverse engineering the adjustments can serve as a great way to kickstart forming a style of your own. In the next lesson, I'll show you how to save parts of your signature look in presets so that you can apply them to images later on. That helps you consistently apply your go-to effects. Because you're literally saving those adjustments and reapplying them, you know that you stay consistent within your signature look. Your signature look won't be developed overnight. It takes a lot of experimentation. It's also okay if it evolves over time to include new looks and feels. However, it's great to be opinionated about your style and have those go-to tweaks that set you apart. Lean into your opinions about how adjustments should work to work towards your signature style. So, you've been building out your style and experimenting with creative adjustments. In fact, you've been enjoying it so much that you want to lock in the style you've created for future use. Let's learn how to do that in this lesson with Adobe Lightroom presets. They give you one-click instant looks to apply to your images. After you finish styling an image, let's save the style as a preset for future use. Lightroom presets are collections of settings that you can apply with one click later. Working in the Develop module and with our edited image selected, find the Presets panel here on the left side. Let's click on the plus button here to begin to create a new preset. On the new Develop preset menu, we have a choice of what settings are included in a preset. We're taking edits we've applied to the active image, choosing which ones to use, and saving it to the preset. When we leave one of these boxes ticked, we signal to Lightroom that it's a setting that should be a part of our preset. There's an art to knowing what to include in a Lightroom preset. What I like to think about is what's specific to the style I've created. For example, an exposure adjustment varies image by image, so it's not a style adjustment. For my example, I'm going to leave the color settings, color grading, white balance, and tone curve selected. These are the settings that are kind of specific to the style I've created. It's always best to only include the parts of the adjustment that you wish to use. Let's give the preset a name. I'm also going to make sure that it's going to the user presets group so that it's easy to find and apply later on. What I might recommend later on is to create a set of toolkit presets, like just one that does lens corrections, for example. In that case, you just create a preset with only that checked, and that's because it makes it easy to point and click and apply those adjustments later. Let's go ahead and click Create. Then we'll switch to another image that's already corrected. Let's find our newly created preset here on the left side and click on it to apply. That's it. We've taken the same style that we created and extended it to another image. Now's a good time to remind you as well that you can use other photographers' styles. On Envato Elements, you have an all-you-can-download creative subscription. One of my favorite assets included with an Elements subscription is Adobe Lightroom presets. Let's download one of these and walk through how to use it. These are styles created by other photographers that we can use. After I download a preset, it's typically best to look inside the zip file and find the .lr template files. These are the preset files. In Lightroom, let's click on the same plus button, then choose the import option. I'm going to browse back to the folder where these are stored and select them all at once. Let's click on import. Now, when I scroll down through my user presets, you'll see them added to the app. As always, you can hover over presets to preview how they'll impact the image, or click on one to apply it to the active image. Whether you use presets to borrow styles from others or automate adding your own, don't miss out on this feature. Create your presets to save time, or try out presets from others to expand your editing expertise. What good is a photo that never gets shown off? It's really all about the export, and it's no secret that most of the images that we create will end up online. Until we export, the adjustments we've been previewing aren't applied to the image file because of Lightroom's non-destructive model. The settings we choose while exporting are important so that we find the right balance of quality and file size. We want our images to look good, but also not take too long to upload or use too much storage space. The key is to think about where your images are to be uploaded and how they'll be used. Many sites or platforms might have limits on file size or dimensions. Let's start off by selecting all images that we want to export with a Command or Control-A. Now let's right-click and choose Export, Export. There are many settings on this menu, and we'll learn to tackle the essentials for the web export in this lesson. Let's start off with the most basic settings. Scrolling down, let's make sure that the file settings are JPEG with the color space of sRGB. Those are musts for basically every export. Now we have a few choices to make. First up is quality. This is a case of what I call diminishing returns. A very high setting will create much larger file sizes, but the quality isn't easy to notice visually. As a quick shortcut, here's what I do. If quality is important, I usually set this between 85 and 90. If I know I'm just sharing a preview of images or they're going to a site that adds a lot of compression like Facebook, I'm more in the 70 to 75 quality range. There's no magic number here, but let me give you those two guidelines to save you a lot of time. Another situation you may run into is limiting your file size. Some sites have an absolute file size limit, and then this limit file size to box is a major help. You can tick it, then dial in a limit in kilobytes to limit files to. This will ensure that your images will meet the standard for this site. I'm going to turn this off for our example, but this can be a real lifesaver if your site has a limit. One of the key impacts on file size is the pixel dimensions of a file. Basically, how many pixels wide versus tall is the finished file. It's a good idea to resize your images to fit before posting online. Remember, typically we're uploading copies to share or download, not archival level quality. I will tick the box to resize to fit on the long edge, then choose a pixel dimension. Usually, I'm going to choose something like 2500 pixels with 72 dpi for most online purposes. Your original image files are really large, and a basic resize to 2500 will keep them in check. As always, check your site to determine if there's a limit or suggestion to keep in mind. Now, the one time that you would really want to change this to something larger is if you knew your clients are going to download and print the images, for example. In that case, we'll cover how to deliver to clients in a future lesson. If you didn't sharpen your images in the post-production process, I'll typically tick the Sharpen For box and leave it set to Screen. It's a nice finishing touch for a bit more detail for the web. Just make sure you don't double sharpen the image with the adjustment you've already applied, because images can become pretty grainy pretty quickly. Of course, it's also important to remember that if you upload your images to a platform like Facebook, you might have further compression and adjustments added by the site. Basically, when you push them up to their server, they're going to apply some settings of their own. There's really not a lot that you can do for that situation, so keep in mind how the upload will be perceived based on the platform. The worst case scenario is your clients downloading a Facebook linked image and printing it. Some sites even sharpen on the fly while compressing your image. One last step. Let's go back to the top and adjust the way our images are saved and named. I'm going to start by choosing a location to export from this top menu. I like to leave this set to desktop or somewhere temporary, then tick Put in Subfolder, giving the new folder a name. This is where your images are saved. Let's also tick the Rename To option. We'll make sure this is set to Custom Name Sequence. I like to do this so that if the recipient sees the file names, they aren't just garbled file names from my camera. It's a great idea to set this to a keyword too, in case your images are going on your site, as it can help you with search engines. When we've made all of these choices, press Export. Lightroom will pop up with a window showing the finished images when it's run through the process. It's always a good idea to go through your images after export and make sure that they appear the way you intended. There are times when you accidentally over-sharpen or set something incorrectly, so take just a few minutes to quality check your export. Keep these settings in mind if your images are headed for online distribution. Set your quality, your format, and the name so that your images are truly web ready. In our prior lesson, we focused on getting images ready for the web, focusing on the quality and file size trade-off. In this lesson, we're going to take a different approach, which is delivering images to clients. Now, it's natural that every client's needs are going to differ, and there's truly no one-size-fits-all settings, but this will teach you some important options to consider for every client delivery. What we're going for here is really maximizing quality. This is the last time that we might hand off these images, and we don't know how our clients are going to use them, so giving them the highest quality really helps us out. With our images selected by pressing Command-A on Mac or Control-A on Windows, let's then right-click and choose Export, Export. We're back to the same settings window with all of the variables we need for a successful export. Given that this is a final delivery, we'll change a few options. Let's scroll down and find the file settings first. Again, unless a client has a very specific request, JPEG with sRGB color space is usually a safe bet. What will differ in a client delivery is typically the quality. This isn't the time to skimp on that, since they may use these for prints or large format needs. Let's set this to 95 because the difference is really imperceptible past that point. I also typically will not sharpen a client export. Instead, I handle sharpening when post-processing. If you don't do that, you could end up with double sharpened, overly detailed images. Let's also scroll back up and again, make sure that we're going to put images in a subfolder and apply a rename. Your clients will thank you for cleaner file names that aren't just seemingly random. I'm using that same custom sequence setting so that we give it a cleaner file name. When that's finished, we can go ahead and click on Export to kick off the process. When it's finished, we have our folder with the final images. Again, it's definitely a good idea to flip through the images and make sure that you didn't miss anything. There's nothing worse than leaving something like a watermark or too much sharpening turned on. One question remains: how should you get the images to your clients? There are many services and tools to do that, and it's easier to explain what you shouldn't do. Don't ever use a service like Facebook or Google Photos that applies compression that is additional to what we've already done. Putting your images on these sites means that your clients just won't get the best copy. What I typically will do is zip the files first. When you're working in a folder full of images, you can select them all and right-click or command-click to create a zip file. This puts them in one convenient package that only requires one upload. It also ensures that the service doesn't do any more compression or alterations to the image since it sees a zip and not individual image files. Then I'll use a service like WeTransfer or Dropbox to drop off the zip file. In the case of Dropbox, I like to place the zip in a dedicated delivery folder. Then once it uploads, I can get a shareable link. It's a great idea to use a service that gives you confirmation of when the files have been downloaded so that you have that proof of delivery. Dropbox's transfer service actually makes that possible. The key is to not let files hang out too long or have confusion about if things were received. To protect yourself, ask your client for written confirmation via email or such to avoid the mix-up. Export settings are all about getting the file in the format, quality, and settings that a recipient needs. Set the quality high, find a good place to share, and your clients are sure to thank you for the extra effort. In this course, you learn how to use Adobe Lightroom to conquer your image collection, organize them efficiently, and style them to perfection. As you've seen, Lightroom is really many apps inside of one convenient package, and you've scratched the surface on all of them. But make no mistake, the fun is just getting started. The real power of Lightroom really starts to show itself as you work with your own images. You'll start building out your own creative style, finding what works for you, and dialing in those adjustments that really bring your images to life. I'm really excited to see what you create with the new techniques that you've learned in this course. Make sure to check out the Envato Tuts Plus channel and subscribe to learn Illustrator, Photoshop, Lightroom, and so much more. I'm Andrew Childress for Envato, and thanks so much for watching.